Malolele and welcome everyone to another live digital kava session here on the Polynesian Eyes podcast. You have myself, Tua Fale, coming in from Southern Nevada, from the entertainment capital of the world, Las Vegas. And we're really excited for the program today. Have a great opportunity here to give the people what they're asking for, as Mr. Aotearoa says, give the people what they're asking for. And that is, there's been some. Oh, hi, Tiger Star. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. That's my daughter Diana there. She's sitting in there and watching. Um, anyways, really appreciate the viewers, the listeners. We've been tagged. There's a handful of new videos that have come out by Roots of Polynesia. A lot of tagging, people asking questions, and there's enough attention giving to it that in response, we want to answer those questions and those requests. And we're going to spend some time. I mean, we've talked about it on a few other live digital kava sessions, and we'll continue to do so as long as there are people asking for responses. So there's a handful of videos that we're going to respond to today. We're going to walk through some data points, some information that we think is important to take into consideration. So we're going to have some presentations that we've asked our digital assistant to prepare for us and kind of have that drive some of our conversation here today. So with that being said, let me go ahead. I forgot to add these before the show started, so I apologize for that. I'm just going to add them here so they're kind of ready, sitting in the background when we get to it. Couple housekeeping items. Really appreciate everyone's support. Every like, share, comment really goes a long way. Every subscription. So if you're not already a subscriber of the Polynesian Eyes podcast on our various platforms, please do so. Always forget to mention it when we go on live. There's the hype button. Hype it. It does increase our exposure. And as mentioned, we do have a great following and appreciate all the paying members of the channel on YouTube. Really do appreciate that. If you have a specific question or comment, our paying members from the YouTube channel, they always get preference. One of the ways we recognize them and their contributions is they get preferential treatment on the lives and their questions and comments. If you aren't a paid member and want to contribute a live digital, a digital kava bag, use the super chat. We do make a effort to recognize all the super chats that come through. So really, there's a couple videos. Like I said, we're gonna come here real quick. Let me share this. Let's see. All right. So, we do get a lot of comments. There's a lot of activity on this Roots of Polynesia all over on our social media. So they've come out with quite a few videos in a short amount of time. Hey, awesome. We appreciate them. Great content, makes our job easier. We appreciate it. That brings all the ideas that people are sharing as why they believe certain things that they believe. They put it into a concise video, makes our life easier, right? Especially when we see people commenting and saying, Polynesian Eyes podcast, Tevita Fale, this officially has wrecked you. This has destroyed your position. And you know what? We look at it, we've watched a bunch of the videos. A lot of it is nothing new. Actually, I can't think of a single kind of concept that they've shared that's like, hey, you know what? That's something new that we haven't come across. A lot of it is a lot of them are ideas that we've already addressed and we will continue to address. We mention this every time. We will revisit and we will address them every time they come up. And as Mr. Aotearoa says, we will give the people what they want. So let's see. We're going to start with a couple. Let's start with this one first. I think, last time we did one video and it took us a whole hour. And like I said, I have 2 presentations prepared. We're going to try maybe get through 3 videos. If we do, great. We're just going to go as far as we go. And if there's comments and questions from the viewers, we will stop and pause for those, discuss any of those if it makes sense. But we're going to definitely kind of walk through these videos, a couple of them, and address them. And this is why it's awesome that Roots of Polynesia has these videos, because we can just pull them up, listen to the argument, respond to it, give feedback, and that drives more conversation, that drives more content for us, that hopefully motivates Roots of Polynesia to continue doing what they're doing. And then everyone who listens in can hear both sides, have a discussion on it, and then go from there. Right? Go from there on what they think is the logical answer and solution. So, with no further delay, let's jump into the first. And we've seen this video multiple times, but this one I didn't have a deck for, but we're just going to present one important piece of information and maybe respond to whatever else kind of comes to mind. But we think that there's just one quick arrow here to resolve. And then we may get to the other videos.
The Tuitonga lineage started from Samoa.
The Tuitonga, to be more specific, the Tuitonga lineage and the Tuitonga Empire originally from Samoa. Originally started from Samoa.
And note that these are the Tongan experts, right? These are guys who have some level of education, probably have done some PhDs, and want to have some conversations on that. So yeah, just kind of these are the quote unquote experts.
The Tuikanokupolu, interestingly, the Tuikanokupolu dynasty as well, originally from some Tuitonga from Manua, Tuikanokupolu from Upon. Okay? And we don't have to hide that. It's not an embarrassment. Samoa was part of Tonga. Tonga was part of Samoa. When the Manua Empire fell, the Tuitonga Empire emerged. We are from Manua. The Tongans, they don't like that. Not the Tongan people, but the Tongan Empire. The Tongan dynasty originally was begun from these people.
They were the hierarchy. They were the Eki. Came from Samoa to Tonga.
The first tradition that I want to touch on, the beginning of Tonga, or Talatupuanga or Tonga. As you can see on the screen, I have summarized some notes on this tradition that Talakamataanga or Tonga is a story about Tangaloa, and he was the first to make or to build a Tonga, a system in Tonga, and Tonga became a subsidiary dominion of the Tui Manua, Samoa Atoa sovereignty. Now, I want to add on this information about Samoa Atoa, or the Tui Manua. We are going back to Samoa, to the eastern part of Samoa. There is a group of islands there, 3 main islands, and that whole group of islands is called Manua. And Tangaloa started the Samoa Atoa in Manua. Samoa Atoa literally translated as all Samoa. And they were consisted of 6 main islands: Tonga, Fiji, Samoa, Tahiti, Rarotonga, and Oahu in Hawaii. Those are the islands that made up all Samoa. They're all Samoa islands. And Tangaloa is the family name of the Tui Manua.
Of the gods from Langi, which we always talk about the gods when we refer to the Tangaloa, to Tangaloa Eitimatupua. That's our Langi part.
I'm of Tongan heritage, and Langi also symbolically means, in Tongan oral history, Samoa, and Mama means Tonga.
Lang and Mama both mean sky and earth, respectively. There's a third Pulotu, which is the symbolic name for Fiji. Of all three, they all metaphorically represent the past, present, and future, respectively.
The Tuitonga lineage started
So basically, the claim here is first off, Tangaloa comes from Samoa, right? So and this will be interrelated. We're going to walk through the genetic studies that are referenced in another video we'll go through. We'll also walk through the archaeological evidence that totally refutes that, right? It totally refutes that the Polynesian culture and empire began in Samoa. So that's just, we'll get to that. I'll grab that piece, we'll put that to the side because we'll revisit it. The idea here is that the Tu'i Tangaloa / Tu'i Manua is the origin of the Tu'i Tonga, which is it's fascinating. There is oral history in Tonga of Tangaloa residing on Tonga Tapu, right? And let me share this tab. We've had this discussion a bazillion times, and just so that everyone's kind of aware, this is Tonga Tapu, the main island, and in this area right here, Folaha, Longotembe, Vaini area, there's the capital. Oh, I'm not sharing the tab here. Let me bring that to the stage. Apologize. I'm getting carried away here. Let's make this a little bit bigger. There we go. So we'll hide this. Sorry. So just to kind of view, it's Tonga Tapu right here. We're going to talk through it. And this is Nuku'alofa. We zoom in a little bit. This is Folaha Longoteme area. This is where they're building that Whangauta Lagoon bridge that's coming across. So there is discussion of Tangaloa. There's discussion about Maui. Yet there is no clear claim by others. Samoa says that Tangaloa lived there, lived in the mountains, right? The ninth heaven where the 9 mountain ranges. And that's where Tangaloa resided. And that the title of Tangaloa, the oral history is the title of Tangaloa was given to Samoa because Tangaloa came down, saw a woman that he liked that was already married to some other dude. And Tangaloa says, I want your wife, I'll give you the title. So that's how the name Tangaloa gets started in Samoa against, according to some oral history there. Now, Tonga's oral history. And remember, before we get to Tonga's oral history, Samoa is colonized, right? By the Germans, by the Americans, by the UK. And through that colonization, they get access and exposure to the outside world. They get education. They get into the education. This is where Margaret Mead and all these people start studying. Margaret Mead, I mean, obviously, started studying Samoan culture, came up with their definition. So that is where some of these stories of Samoan oral history gets the early exposure. That's what drives a lot of this narrative that's been going on forever. And Tonga, who is just trying to survive colonization, and because they survive colonization and maintain their sovereignty, you become more isolated and you don't get that exposure. However, this is what we're bringing to the table. In Tonga, the oral history within the longest settlement of the Tu'i Tonga, right here in Mua, and specifically in the Lapaha area, this is where you find all the langis, right? You hear the term langi that's discussed there. In Tonga, right? There's langis in Tonga. And this term, and you find it all throughout. This area right here is about 100 acres of reclaimed man-made land. That was all ocean and lagoon. And so that's reclaimed upon that land and upon all other. Look at these. These are all different langis, right? These are all langis right here that are built all throughout La Paha. You find them everywhere. They're found throughout La Paha. And then you also come like into areas like this, I believe this is another one. This is kind of like a langi, but this is the Tu'ihatakalawas. And so it's not called a langi, it's called a fale. And then, so Tonga has not had this exposure, this opportunity to share its oral history. But this is the oral history of Tonga. Is number one, there is a place called Langi right here. And unfortunately, this has all been mined. The reason why this place is where Tangaloa resided, it was the highest point on all of Tongatapu, and it was an elevated location. All that rock has been quarried, right? It was quarried over decades. That quarry has been that land has been quarried away. This is where Tangaloa resided, right? And so this is where he resided. This is where Aho'eitu came to meet his father Tangaloa. And obviously his mother resided on the opposite side in Popua, and that's where Tangaloa resided according to Tongan oral history. And the same time Tangaloa resided there, to the east is where Maui resided. That's where the Ha'amonga of Maui is there. We do not take the position that the Ha'amonga of Maui was a entrance to the compound of Tu'itonga, Momo, and Tu'itatui. It was built before the Tu'itonga, and it served as the navigational knowledge verification, right, of the Ha'amonga constellation in the skies. It was a physical representation of that constellation, and it also, tracked the movement of the sun and also represented the heavens as well. So Maui resides on eastern Tonga, right? Tangaloa resides in the center of Tonga in this area. And then to the west is where the Taula or the Lo'au resided, because to the west is a representation of where life ends, and that's where Pulotu is. So obviously the Taula and the Lo'au, they reside to the west. That is Tongan oral history. I do not know where these gentlemen got this oral history that Tonga comes from Samoa and that Tangaloa is from Samoa. When you speak to people from the Niwas, Vaipopua does not go to Samoa at any moment. Aho'eitu's mother. Aho'eitu's mother, and coming all the way up here to Niwa, right? You have Niwa right here. Popua comes from there, which is right next to Samoa. But she leaves there and she comes to Tongatapu. And why does she go to Tongatapu? Because that's where Tangaloa resides. That's why she leaves her home. She does not go to Samoa because Tangaloa does not reside in Samoa. She comes to Tonga. That's where she marries Tangaloa. And that's where Aho'eitu is born. That's where he grows up. And then Aho'eitu comes to visit his father here, right? And so that's the oral history. Where this idea that Tangaloa is Samoan and that the Tu'imanua is the origin of where the Tu'itonga comes from, I never heard it once growing up in Tonga. Does not exist. And as you can see, these academics, they go overseas, and remember, Tonga is isolated, going through surviving through colonization. When Tongans are going to go overseas and they go to the academia, the only way I can think of is the prevailing thought is the narrative that's already coming out of Samoa, which is, Samoa is the sacred center, right? Which grammatically does not align with Samoan grammar nor Tongan grammar. You know what does align in grammar for a name that means sacred is Tonga Tapu, like right here. Tonga, Tapu, sacred south, right? Where the adjective comes after the noun. Samoa as the sacred center, though that is what's expressed, does not grammatically doesn't make sense. The only way you can make it make sense is just say, hey, it's broken Samoan. Because if it was sacred center, it would be Moa-sa, not Samoa. But we call it Ha'amoa because Sa also means Ha'a or clan, and Moa means the Moa clan, right? That was one of the main families that was sent to settle Samoa. That's why the Tu'imanua has their, I don't know if you want to call it mascot or island identity and flag. It's on their flag. It's a chicken, right? I mean, that right off the bat, that just makes more sense than this, mumbo jumbo of Tu'imanua and so forth being the origin of Tonga. And that's before we get to the genetic and the archaeological evidence that we'll go through later. The other one is, and this is from Tui, I can't remember his name, but he's a content creator online. And he made a fascinating discovery. And what was that discovery, you might say? And that discovery is the origin of the word tui or tui in Samoa, right? So here's the word. And this is George Pratt's dictionary. It is considered the most reliable and the go-to dictionary for the Samoan language, right? This gentleman lived in Samoa, I want to say 40 years, compiled. It has a whole section, as you can see here. It's 430 pages. It has a detailed grammar, detailed structure, detailed concepts, and it has a pretty strong dictionary. And it is considered the most reliable and respected dictionary, right? Probably one of the oldest ones too. It was written in the 1800s. And so just think about this. If the Tui Tonga comes from the Tu'imanua, quote unquote, then the word Tui in Samoa should be very simply a Samoan word, right? That should be a no-brainer, just like it's a no-brainer, like, hey, if that's where it originates from, because that's what's being argued by these quote unquote Tongan experts. We've invited them and they're welcome. We've invited the Lo'au University to join us. We've invited Dr. Fujimahina. We've also invited the other Tariai to join us. Crickets. I don't blame them because this is just common sense. I just don't know where they're getting this stuff from besides, hey, that's what we're hearing at school. We don't want to make waves. We just want to fit in, get our degree, get our influence, and move on. Okay, that's fair. Nothing wrong with that besides, you're not helping the truth and reality. But anyways, let's zoom in here. So it says Tui right here. It says the first definition of it is a high chief, a king. Then it says and then we'll go to the next. A Tongan word. Wait a second. A Tongan word? How does that work? How does that work that if the Tui Tonga originates from the Tu'imanua and we have multiple Tu'is in Samoa, but the early Samoans are saying it's a Tongan word? How does that make sense? Right? Because it doesn't. Like all these things, these ideas, like these quote unquote experts, these are all new ideas. This is what happens when you don't know the history. And I'm not saying I know the history. I've talked to a bunch of people. We've interviewed a bunch of these people, right? The oral history that I grew up and heard was from the capital of the Tu'itonga Empire, Mu'a. That's where I grew up. Never heard of the Tu'imanua. Never heard of any other empire having influence in Tonga besides the Tu'itonga. Then we have these quote unquote experts. Experts on what? I have no idea. I literally have no idea what they're experts on. because it does. Number one, it doesn't. You don't even have to be a doctor to say, that don't make sense, right? I've been to Samoa and American Samoa, didn't see any langis, right? Didn't see any of that. Didn't see those things. People bring up the Pulimele. Okay, never heard of the Pulimele. Oh, look, this is the Samoan langis up there. Okay. Well, I go ahead and I look at it, and then I find out, we've covered this extensively. The Pulimele is a word that does not exist. Once again, made up history, a modern idea. They interview the locals. The locals say, we've never heard of the term Pulimele. You know what we have heard? We have heard by the people who grew up here and the people who taking care of this land for generations. It's called Tapatonga. Oh, yeah. And those flat rocks at the top of the Pulimele and in those areas? Yeah, that's where the Tuitonga sat because he resided here. Do you ever hear that? Do you ever hear these experts talk about that? No. Instead, they come up with this fake news. Langi means Samoa. Langi means Samoa, but I can't find any langis in Samoa. Oh, it's the mountains. How convenient when I can go to Tonga and find langis where tu'is resided, where people of power and influence resided. Well, that makes a lot more sense to me. Maybe I'm a little too simplistic. Maybe I'm just too simple of a guy. Maybe my imagination is not up to snuff for these imaginations, right? And Taliai goes, and there's the sacred umiti that was a tribute. Nobody's ever heard of the umiti. Nobody has any idea. You know what people have heard? Inasi and Polo Polo. That's what people heard. And not just people heard, it was documented by the West. It was still going on when the Westerners came to the South Pacific. And yet I'm supposed to believe in umiti and that Langi is the mountains and that's where Tangaloa came from. And yet it just seems to make more sense, the Tongan version. People get angry and say, oh, we're biased to Tonga's. Like, number one, if it's right, it's right. Come up with something better. So that's the first part. The second part is we have Samoan blood, right? We have someone they've done the DNA, right? I mean, especially from Upolu and a little bit from Savai'i. I have nothing from Manua, but Upolu and Savai'i, I have quite a bit of relatives there, and we'll get into that, why that makes sense. One of the things we're going to hopefully talk about tonight is Tupo, the first letter. That's another one we hear a lot about. But, to end this video in response to that video of the experts say that, there's a lot of things wrong with it, but let's just drop that one there to Roots of Polynesia. If the experts that you quote there are correct, that the Tu'itonga comes from the Tu'imanua, then why is the most trusted and one of the oldest dictionaries say Tu'i is not a Samoan word, it's a Tongan word? And I will say, back then there was no Samoan nation, Tongan nation. It was all one people under the Tu'itonga. Okay. But the reason why it's referred to as a Tongan word is because the Tu'itonga was from Tonga. That's where the Tu'i comes from. Tangaloa instituted the first Tu'i in Tonga with the Tu'itonga before the Tu'imanua, before the Tu'i Aana, before the Tu'i whatevers, right? Before the Samoa Atoa, whatever that is, there was the Tu'itonga. And that's why they say that's a Tongan word, because that's when they first hear it. That's where it comes from. Pretty straightforward. Answer that before we go into this other mumbo jumbo. This gentleman saying, oh, the Tu'ikanukupolu, the Tu'itonga all come from Samoa. Is like, well, let's solve that little puzzle first. That's something that's not purely oral history. This is something that's a little more concrete. Let's answer that. And I think they can chew on that for a while. We'll see what Roots of Polynesia comes up with, what other kind of editing that he can come up with to try and make that work. So that's the first video. I'm trying to stay on track here, guys. I'm trying not to get too carried away with these videos because we want to try and get through a handful of them, right? So that addresses this Tu'i Manua, this Tu'i Kanukupolo. We've already kicked that thing to death. It's always the women come from Samoa, but that, you know, the male was always a Tongan male, and that's what gave inheritance to the titles. Still practiced to this day in Tonga in land ownership. Land is transferred through the male line, right? You can marry whoever you want to marry, but it's through the male line that inheritance is passed through. Let's go to this other video here. Let me bring this up. And this is, once again, it kind of goes into the Langi Mama thing. And, you know, I think it's the second half of that we want to talk about in this video. And once again, this is from Roots of Polynesia. You know, he's coming up with this amazing content. I mean, it's good. I don't want to say it's not good. This content's good because it makes life easier for us, consolidates these ideas so that we don't have to, you know, chase after it and try to put it together. This is good. This makes a target. This gives us an easier target. Believe it or not, we like it, even though we know that, you know, we don't agree with it and we think it's a weak position. But they made the weak position at least more presentable, and we enjoy that. And we'll, you know, it'll take off, and we'll just go, bing, that one's done, even though it's been done before, but it's been repackaged and relaunched, and we'll just go, bing, that one's out. Try again, right? You're welcome. We corrected you from the confusion. If you want to try again, come out with another video, and we'll take care of them one by one. So let's watch this video. It's going to talk about the Langi and the Mama, but I think the second portion of it may talk a little bit more about what one of the presentations
heritage,
are.
and Langi also symbolically means in Tongan oral history Samoa, and Mama means
Don't know
Tonga.
which oral history.
Lang and Mama both mean sky and earth, respectively.
Once again, the sky, that's one very simple. Langi also means the Tu'itonga's residence. It also means where Tangaloa resided, not necessarily Samoa. And I don't know where this Mama mumbo jumbo comes from either.
It's a third Pulotu, which is the symbolic name for Fiji. Of all three, they all metaphorically represent the past, present, and future, respectively.
Oh, actually, we're going to skip.
Upon his return,
This is
in
what
our
I want to watch.
Constitution, we are free from the bondage of the chief abusing us.
King George II often voyaged to Samoa, opening new chapels at 3 different places. Upon his return, he wrote a letter to the Wesleyan missionaries. Documented in the 1855 book Tonga and the Friendly Islands, he wrote, "Dear friends, I, George, having just returned from Samoa, think proper to inform you of the reason of my voyage there and the cause of my interfering with the people of Samoa. The relationship of Tonga and Samoa people has been of old. From thence, Samoa, sprang our progenitors, ancestors, the governing families of Tonga as the family of Tui Tonga and Tui Kanokopol-U, the latter being the family of Tupou, king of Tonga, and of George, king of Vava'u and Ha'abai, which is the same with the chief Mumui. There are 3 languages."
So that's what we're going to kind of focus on a little bit here, right? This pops up so many times, so many different ways. And so we put together some slides here. We'll walk through it. We'll kind of talk through it. And, you know, just to kind of kick off, we'll show the references that we're kind of primarily using this from. And there's two kind of articles. One is a Gunson 1990. This is from a paper out of Oxford that was written talking about the relationship of Tonga and Samoa before Western contact, and he references this letter, and then also referencing Faupula and Cummins 2010, where there's a full translation of that letter, right? And so that's what's driving this. And so we're going to talk through this. From thence sprang our progenitors, right? That's where this whole thing of, oh, this is why we come from Samoa, right? Not just Tonga, but all of Polynesia. Just like that other video, right? Oh, we come from there, and that's why this, and that. So, first thing is, before Christianity, how closely were Tonga and Samoa already connected? And this is something that we can't really like highlight even enough. Tonga and Samoa, like, were not these quote unquote independent nations, right? Samoa did not have a national identity of, oh, we are the nation of Samoa. That didn't exist. Like, that is a result of colonization. That's where that comes from. Prior to that, there was no national identity of Samoa. The identity was tied more to your clan and your people, like your ancestors, your relations, your family relations. That is what drove identities. It was not this, oh, we are unified under the Samoan flag, under the Tongan flag. No, it was what family relations that you have, what historical context. That's why marriage is an important part. We have it right there. Marriage was the driver of identity. It was clans. That's why the Tongans called Samoa Ha'amoa, right? Like, that was what was the kind of like cohesive glue, so to speak, for those group of islands, because they descended from the Moa clan, those navigators that settled Samoa. Now, could there have been already people there? Maybe, right? Maybe they were the first settlers. Maybe they were the first people to go there and bring some, bring that Polynesian civilization, if there were people existing there before. But the point is, this is why in Tonga it's called Ha'amoa. And that is a much better way to view what the Polynesian Empire or Confederate States, whatever you want to call it, the cohesive unit that bridged us together was familial ties by clan. And that's how you aligned yourself. And at the end of the day, at the very pinnacle of those clans was the Tu'itonga. That's where the term Tu'i comes from. That is the pinnacle or the highest level of those clans. So before Christianity arrives, it was marriage. That's what drove the exchange. That's what drove the production of tools and of resources for trade. That's what drove a lot of the custom and the language. It was familial ties that led to military alliances. That's what led to, those gifts, those titles, those obligations. That's what Gibson or Gunson is expressing in his article and all the research that he's done. And that aligns a lot closer with Polynesian behavior and oral history and what connected people. So this idea that, oh, we all originated from Samoa, the nation of Samoa, that's not what Tupou the First is talking about. Number one, he's not writing a letter of saying, I'm writing this letter to prove this is where we all come from. He's writing a political letter. And we have to remember, he's writing this letter because there's the London Mission Society and then there's the Methodist Church. The London Missionary Society initially first came to Tonga. They gave up rights to Tonga to go and focus on Samoa, and the Methodists are focusing more on Tonga, right? And so you have the Europeans, they've already started to divide Tonga and Samoa through religious lines. We haven't gotten to colonization yet, but through religious lines and claiming of rights of teaching religion, they're doing a separation. And they were trying to enforce that separation upon Tonga and Samoa. And Tupou the First is writing and telling them, dude, you can't separate us. I don't care about your Methodist separation from the London Missionary Society, LMS. We're related. We're the same people. We're family, right? Because we've been doing it for thousands of years. You just showed up yesterday with this these concepts of geographical boundaries that has no real claim right now. And when you read the letters that come from Samoa, when they're asking Tupou the First for assistance, they're saying, "We are your children. You are our fathers." And there are Samoan chiefs in Tonga, and there are Tongan chiefs in Samoa, meaning we're all the same people. Why wouldn't you come and answer our help, our request for help and support? Right? The Samoans that are writing these correspondences to the Tupou the First, they're not saying, "We're Samoa, you're Tonga, blah, 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 blah." They're like, no, dude. We're the same people. Right? They even go and say, "We're your sons. We are your children." So should I say, oh, off of that, that's evidence that Samoa comes from Tonga? No, it doesn't make sense in that context, because in that context, they're trying to establish familial ties and relationships through the marriages that have been going on for thousands of years, and reinforcing that clan-like identity that obligates Tupou the First to respond. You have an obligation as our kin, as our clan, to respond to our requests, because we are, quote unquote, the same civilization. We're the same people. We're the same culture. There are nuances in between us, right? But we're the same group. We're the same people. So this is where we need to understand how it works. It was that kinship that shaped the power, right? High-ranking families intermarried across the ocean. This has oral history behind it. We've done the studies where the history between Tonga and Samoa on the oral history and the stories are very focused on practical things, marriage, trade, even some quote unquote scuffles, family scuffles. Those are what's primarily tied to with Tonga. But then when they go to Fiji, it's all about like mystical things, like their myths. And so the analysis was the relationship with Tonga was very practical and firsthand. The understanding of Fiji was secondhand, primarily through the Tongans, who the Tongans are very well documented of interacting with Fiji, right? The Tuikana Upolu line had a Samoan maternal connection from Safata and Upolu. Okay. That wasn't the first time through the Tuikana Upolu, like we mentioned. The Tuihata Kalaua, the Tuitonga were intermarrying into Samoa, Uvea, right? They were intermarrying into Tahiti, into Hawaii, Cook Islands, all over. There's the intermarrying for the exact same reasons that we're talking about. They were intermarrying into Ha'amoa. It was maintaining those family lines. That is where power and influence and obligation and the relationships were kind of solidified. These ties created real rights and real obligations. This is what is being expressed by our Samoan brothers and sisters to Tupou the First. They're saying, "Hey, dude, we are one family. You owe a response to me." This is what basically the entire Polynesian civilization was built off of, right? Is familial obligation to each other as a civilization and group of people. That if people in the Cook Islands needed something from one of the other islands, they would say, "Hey, we are family. You have an obligation to take care of me, just like I have an obligation to take of you." That is the quote unquote civilizational identity. That was the cohesive nature of, if you want to call it a nation, so be it, whatever, just that unifying identity throughout Polynesia. That was the the cohesive glue. It was the familial ties, which is why intermarrying and maintaining those relationships were critical and such a huge deal. This is why family is such a huge deal for Polynesians. It's because it's ingrained and it's integrated in our blood and in our DNA for thousands of years. Okay, you know, when chiefs were family across islands, what did that make possible? You know, that kinship could make travel, alliances, marriage, refuge, assistance, and intervention more legitimate. This is exactly what Tupo the First leveraged to go from Ha'apai and Vava'u to Tongatapu. This is what, you know, Ulukalala and others who tried to get a foothold onto Tongatapu during the civil wars in Tonga could never really establish, is because they really didn't have a strong, legitimate case to enter Tongatapu and to get followership and leadership. Tupo the First grandfather was a Tu'ikanukupolu. It was his father, his grandfather that was assassinated, right, by Ukalala and Tupo Niwa with William Mariner. So he has direct lines and ties to it. His mother has direct, Tupo the First mother has direct ties to the Tu'itonga. So Tupo the First has strong claims to go and help his uncle Alea Motua, who is a Christian, right? That's what makes his bringing of Vava'u and Ha'apai to Tongatapu so powerful. It's the legitimacy that he brings to the table. That is what Tupo the First is expressing in this letter to these Western missionaries who are trying to tell him, no, you need to stay in Tonga because that's where the Methodists have been given the authority. You need to leave Samoa alone, right? Because that's under the London Missionary Society. And Tupo the First is saying no. And if you read that whole context behind it, he's trying to tell the Western missionaries, you cannot dictate that to us. We have a right to choose here. And this is probably the early stages of Tupo the First recognizing, though he has become a Christian, though he is converted from the Toa Ofa experience where, you know, there was kind of like a Pentecostal event that goes throughout Tonga that included Tupo the First, that really drove his conversion to a very high degree, that though that was the good, but he recognized that he could not put full trust and reliance on the Western missionaries because they had their own politics going on. They had their own interests going on. And that's why eventually Tupo the First cut ties, right? It was the Tongan tides and the Tongan missionaries that really kicked the growth and the expansion of Christianity throughout Polynesia and even into Melanesia, right? It was the Tongan missionaries and it was the Tongan tithing funds that really empowered the growth of the Christian religion throughout Polynesia. That's pretty straightforward. All right. Coming to the next slide here, the mission change the stakes. I said for Taufa'ahau, Samoan Methodists were relatives asking for help. This was not some foreign relationship here. This is what I was mentioning. The London Committee, Samoa and Tonga were separate mission fields to be managed. This is what we're kind of mentioning here. That's kind of like the angle you have to look at that letter. And what Tupo the First is trying to establish. He's trying to establish kinship. It's not about origin. It's not about, you know, anything else besides legitimizing his interference in Samoa, which that's what the Western missionaries are saying. You're interfering with Samoa. And Tupo the First is almost saying, no, you're interfering with my clan's relations and the way we function, because we're not separate nations. We are one nation. We are one people. Right? That's what Tupo the First is trying to communicate into that letter. The context behind the letter, right? A letter after Manono in 1842. The context cues are Taufa'ahau had returned from Samoa a large assembly had been held in Manono, he wrote to the Wesleyan Missionary Committee, right? And it goes, from thence sprang our progenitors, the governing families of Tonga, as the family of the Tu'itonga and the Tu'ikanukupolu. Now, we've had this conversation many times before. What's the driver? It's like, the meaning becomes more precise. The phrase refers to our progenitors in relation to the governing families of Tonga, specifically the Tu'itonga and the Tu'ikanukupolu. Read in full, it is a statement about the ancestry and political relationship of high-ranking chief lines. It is not a claim that all Tongan people as a population originated from Tonga. And when we talk about this, progenitors, there are male and female progenitors. We do not doubt that the Tu'itonga and the Tu'ikanukupolo and even the Tu'ihatakalaua, some of them have their progenitors from Samoa. Why? Because they intermarried. But that is also true of Uvea, Futuna, Tahiti, Hawaii, Cook Islands, probably Tokelau as well, right? Because the Tu'itonga and the Tu'ikanukupolo and the Tu'ihatakalaua, they had multiple wives and they were intermarrying to maintain those political relationships throughout the Polynesian islands. So this is a discussion about legitimacy of interference into quote unquote separate, what's perceived of separate nations or geographic locations by the West. But Tupou I is saying, no, your perceptions of division between us does not have legitimacy there. Kind of got carried away here. There's a lot of comments here. Let me see here. A lot of sorry, got carried away. It doesn't let me go through some of these questions here. Paying member of the Polynesian Eyes podcast here, Mika. He says, Malo Tua, finally catch you on a live. Appreciate it, Mika. Appreciate the support and look forward to continuing our journey here. So Malo, appreciate that. Let me see any other paying members that Malo TYZ for the $5 digital cover bag. Appreciate it. And really appreciate that contribution. Malo Obito. A lot of guys, a lot of comments here. Can't get through all of them. It says, how does it go from Langi Mama Pulop to past, present, and future? That's a good question, Mika. That's why we've invited him to come on the show. Haven't had too much luck. Lot of comments here. Just going to skip here. And yeah, okay. All right. We're kind of pretty much caught up here. And so we'll continue. We'll go from there. Let me hide this. It looks like I was waiting to see the comment section here on the platform kind of highlight that new comments came through, but I guess it doesn't. I'll just periodically check every once in a while. Let's see here. The keywords are governing families, progenitors of the Tu'itonga and the Tu'ikanukupolu lines, chiefly genealogy names, who descends from whom and why it matters. High titles are not random. They are carried within recognized lines. Relationships are inherited, defining rights, responsibilities, and leadership. What changes when we read the whole phrase, not just the one part, is number one is understanding the differences on how, heirs and inheritance are perceived from both sides. Because the Tu'itonga is just embedded, it's patriarchal, it's always father to son, and that the father has always been and must be a Tongan, quote unquote, a direct male lineage. When you say progenitors, it's almost implicit in when Tupou I says progenitors that everyone knows they're talking about the female progenitors, right? That especially when you're talking about the Tu'itonga and the Tu'ikanukupolu. Now, when you go to the chiefs below the Tu'itonga and the Tu'ikanukupolu, that is almost interchangeable, right? Because you could have a quote unquote father residing in Samoa who gets brought back to Tonga, or from Tonga sent to Samoa, and the intermarrying there changes. That is something that is kind of the definition that a lot of people are using online for progenitors. That applies probably a lot closer to the lower ranking chiefs. But once you get to the Tu'itonga and the Tu'ikanukupolo and the Tu'ihatagalaua, it is pretty strict. And even maybe the next layer of upper high chiefs, just below the Tu'i, those are heavily male dominated from father to son, and those are kind of reflect the Tu'itonga and the Tu'ikanukupolu. So that is the misrepresentation that we're trying to solve here. Number one, you need to understand that Tupou the First is trying to establish a legitimacy for his interference in Samoa and correcting the missionaries in their thinking that because they've divided through Methodist and London Missionary Society, geographically Tonga and Samoa, he's trying to establish that has no legitimacy with him because he has familial ties back to Samoa. And when he's referencing the Tu'itonga and the Tu'ikanukupolu, it is inherently obvious that he's talking about female progenitors, and that would apply really throughout Polynesia. Tonga would have unique understanding of that because of being the center of the Polynesian Empire. Let's come back to, let's see here. Oh yeah, so there's some people here. A lot of our biggest fans on social media are there. Even our Samoan brothers and sisters heavily joining us in the comments. Great, appreciate it, and continue to have open invitation to any of you who wish, especially like right here. Ray, very active. Appreciate all the comments, Ray. Tevita's interpretation of King George's letter. Is it my interpretation? Yes, it's probably more correct than other interpretations. I would love to hear a better one that's not purely Western perspective, Ray. And yeah, would love to have you join us. We could have this conversation to hear your interpretation and why that makes more sense. So, all right. Let's go to the next one here real quick. This was a genealogical political letter, right? Genealogy could establish ties across the islands. Ties could justify involvement and mutual obligation. Chiefly, language was precise, not casual. That's what we're kind of talking about here. When Tupou the First is saying progenitors, it is embedded in that to understand. If you understand how inheritance happens of the Tu'itonga, the Tu'ihatagalaua, and the Tu'ikanukupolu, you understand what that progenitor is referring to, right? It's not referring to male progenitors because those male progenitors are automatically, in order to be legitimate, have to be Tongan males. It has to be. And that's maybe the issue that maybe our Samoan brothers and sisters kind of don't fully appreciate. In Samoa, you don't have that strict, like, father to son patriarchal structure, right? They don't have that strict. So maybe that's the driver behind the confusion, is if you have a Samoan understanding of how Samoa works, right? I mean, we use this, we joke around about quite a bit about this. The Tu'imanua, one of the last few Tu'imanuas was a female, according to Shalsi Ilayu. Possibly over 50% of the Tu'imanuas were female, according to some of his discussions with those in Manua. And so from the Samoan perspective, when they see the term progenitors, they think, oh, male and female. That's fair. If I'm trying to be generous here, that's a lot closer to the Western perspective. But when you look at from the Tongan perspective, when you say Tu'itonga, Tu'ikanukupolu, Tu'ihatagalaua, progenitors from Samoa, it is one-sided. It is quite clear that when you say Samoan progenitors, we're talking about female progenitors, right? Like no one can name a single Tu'itonga that had a Samoan father as not being a legitimate heir from Tangaloa to Aho'eitu down that was not quote unquote male from that line, which would be a male that originates from Tonga. When you go to Samoa, it's all over the place there. There are male and female Tu'imanuas, right? I think the young lady, or well, she's passed away, but the one I'm referring to is Margaret Young. Like she's the Tu'imanua. And the claim, and that's probably correct for our Samoan brothers and sisters. They say, oh, she was legitimate because her mother came from the Tu'imanua line. In Tonga, that doesn't really make sense for Tongans, especially when you look at it from the traditional Tongan way. The traditional Tongan way is like, sorry, man, if your last name is Young, can't be a legitimate heir. Can't be, because the Tongan traditional system is patriarchal and it's from father to son. That's why, some people make fun of it, but that's why Talaiha Apepe and Talatama, the two brothers, and one of the brothers didn't have any children, and they tried to offer the Tu'itonga to another brother, and he said, no, man, our system says father to son, father to son. So they make up this little new tamato. They say, oh, yeah, they bring a piece of coconut or whatever, and they say, oh, yeah, this is the son of the Tu'itonga that passed away that didn't have an heir. Oh, and his son's name is Pepe or whoever. I can't remember which one was the one that was older or younger. And then after he has a son, then the piece of coconut passes away, and then now we have a father to son situation. You see how it sounds ridiculous, but that's how strict the protocol is. The protocol is so strict that you have to make a father to son claim. And so they follow some of this kind of, strange way of doing it, but that is to legitimize a brother to brother inheritance rather than a father to son. Right? And that's why when Tongans look at Margaret Young as a legitimate Tu'imanua, Tongans are like, yeah, that works in Samoa, but it doesn't work in Tonga. Right? And it works probably not only just in Samoa, but in other parts of Polynesia, because over there, the power is not centralized. A lot of the structures, even in Uvea and Futuna and all, it's decentralized power. Only in Tonga is where it's centralized. But anyways, that is something maybe to consider for our Samoan brothers and sisters. That's why we have such different interpretations of this, because when we see progenitors, Tu'itonga, Tu'ikanokopolu, it is embedded and it's a no-brainer. We're talking about female progenitors, because the inheritance and legitimacy of heirs, it doesn't come from the mother's side. The mother's side can elevate the eiki or the influence of that male, right? Because but your inheritance of the title is from father to son. But if you have that and you also have a very influential or elevated mother, that boosts your influence, right? But it will not matter if you have a Tu'itonga sister, mother, right? The Tu'itonga sister as your mother, that will not legitimize you to the Tu'itonga title. It just will not happen. And it has never happened, right? And that's why it's kind of interesting when people try to say that with the current Tupo family today, a lot of people say, oh, the Tu'ikanokopolu is what's leading the Tu'ikanokopolu line. Not in traditional Tongan perspective, right? Because in traditional Tongan perspective, it's the Tu'ihatakalaua line that's kind of leading us here because Queen Salote, right? The male line for the Tu'ikanukupolu ended with Tupou II because he didn't have a son that was an heir, a legitimate heir, right? They had Queen Salote, but she marries the heir of the Tu'ihatakalaua line. And so that's the male line that's really governing Tonga to this day. It's the Tu'ihatakalaua line. Now, if we were in Samoa, they would say, "Oh yeah, it's the Tu'ikanukupolu line," and we were like, "Well, technically, I mean, genetic material is genetic material." But if we're talking about strict Tongan cultural lines, the Tu'ikanukupolu line ended with Tupou II, and that it's the Tu'ihatakalaua line that's really leading us today. So just some concepts there, just some commentary there on that. Let's get through this. Once again, this letter was not a population origin claim, right? It was just trying to establish legitimacy of Tupou the First's engagement and involvement in Tonga. That's really was the driver behind that. Samoan relatives had asked for teachers. Taufa'ahau defended the right to respond. He rejected outside control over which Lotu people should follow. That was one of the things that's interesting when you take into account what Tupou the First was responding to is really he was pushing back on the Western missionaries, trying to separate Tonga and Samoa because Tonga and Samoa were the same people, right? United through marriages and culture for thousands of years. The strongest reading of this letter is that it was a case of kinship, choice, and authority. Taufa'ahau was the relationship between governing families to defend the Tongan connection to the Samoan Methodists and to challenge the right of distant mission authorities to decide religious path of Samoans and Tongans. The letter's political purpose is more immediate than a general migration or origin narrative. And that's what a lot of people just don't understand when it all boils down to it, right? Is if you don't understand if you don't understand the context behind Tongan heirs and how the Tongan system works, which was the Tu'itonga system, then you would have an improper interpretation of the letter. And also, if you do not understand the politics and the pushback that Tupou the First is trying to offer in this letter, you will also misinterpret the letter as well. So that's the two different ways that it is misguided to take the interpretation that this video shows from Roots of Polynesia, right? This is, and honestly, like, this is the problem with how Roots of Polynesia approaches this. And we discussed this too on the other video. There is a cutting and snipping of like comments, concepts from 50 different sources out of context to build a narrative. Basically, let me put it this way. What Roots of Polynesia and all of our Samoan brothers and sisters kind of accuse the Polynesianized podcast of doing, well, we look at those videos and we can't help but think, nah, man, I think you're taking everything out of context because all you do is scratch a little deeper than 2 millimeters, and all of a sudden it doesn't make any sense. Just like Langi, Mama, and Pulotu, right? Just like this letter, where at the surface, if you don't understand the context, it can totally appear as one thing. But when you look at the context and you dig a little deeper, you soon realize how foolish it is to think that this letter was a claim of origin and that it assumed that Tonga comes from Polynesia, from Samoa as the origin of Polynesia. It does not hold any water, right? And once again, we'll say this till we turn blue. We won't hold our breath. Anyone who disagrees with us, email us, right? Let me put our email in the chat. Email us. We will host you. We will talk to you. We won't be yelling. You know, we will let you. We believe the ideas will speak for themselves, and we want the best ideas to win. And so, if you think you have a better idea, you have better evidence. You know, Ray, who loves to talk online and comment, you know, he's unwilling to. Fine. Hey, not everyone's willing to come on board and have these discussions, but we'll put the email there. See a lot of people throwing in their 2 cents. Come on the podcast, man. Let's let's have a discussion here and let the people want to hear it. Let me put it that way. Give the people what they want. That's what we're doing. That's what we're pursuing. And you know what's hilarious? I must be the Polynesianized podcast is having such an impact um, on the relationship between Samoa and Tonga. I got this funky message of a Samoan brother, maybe it's a sister, but I think it's a brother, kind of trying to say, "What do you think you're doing?" You know, I heard your comments of being the MC or whatever or announcer at the Tafuna. I think there's a Tafuna high school football team coming either in Utah or whatever, and someone was reaching out to me saying, "All right, you know, I was with a bunch of the Samoans, and they said you're the one who was making all those terrible comments and commentary on the Tafuna. Don't you know that the quarterback from Tafuna is Tongan, and a lot of those kids are Tongan?" And I was like, "Dude, I have no idea what you're talking about." You know, I have no idea what you're talking about. Now, if you want to talk about history, if you want to talk about origins, and you're upset with me, I'll own that. I have no problem owning why people get upset with me because of my historical or, you know, interpretation of something like this letter or history. I'll own that. If you know, some people have, you know, messaged me saying some pretty inappropriate things, and I just like, okay, all right. Oh, you know, you need to go lose weight. It's like, okay, all right. Oh, you have no idea. You're just da 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 da. Okay, all right. Doesn't bother me, right? Why do you think I do this? I do this because it doesn't bother me. I do this because I enjoy sharing what I believe my ancestors have done. I owe this to my ancestors, right? You see all the langis and stuff that we showed earlier, probably within my last 3 or 4 generations, I have an ancestor in each one of those, right? Even my own father will probably be in one of those. So for those who come and say, "Oh, they think it's just for, oh, you're just doing this because you want to ruin things," I was like, "No, I do this because I feel it's almost like a obligation to my ancestors." You know, when I say the Tu'itonga and the Tu'ihatakalaua and the Tu'ikanukupolo, that's the blood I have. That's where I come from, right? And that's why I'm here. I'm not here because, oh, I have nothing better to do. I was like, dude, I freaking work full time. I got 8 kids, right? I'm doing as much as I can ever, but we spend time and energy here because that's the obligation I feel I owe my ancestors because they did some amazing things. And if it takes a little sacrifice and a few people getting upset at me because they don't agree, hey, it is what it is. Small price to pay for a lot of the great things that I've just by chance or whatever inherited. So it doesn't bother me one bit. Have another comment here from Mika, paying member of the Polynesianized podcast. Says, totally ruin a lot of people who want to learn truth of our history. 100%. Right? I mean, but if you really want to learn, that's what we're talking about. Mika also says, paying members is definition of puke puke funua malo e ngawe toko. And this is what I'm trying to appreciate it, Mika. This is what I'm trying to say to our Samoan brothers and sisters. Believe it or not, you guys have all that blood as well. Our ancestors were intermarrying for thousands of years. This is all of us. This is, I understand that it can be misinterpreted as, overzealousness on me trying to say Tonga is this and Tonga's that. Was like, but the reality is we're all one people. We were intermarrying for thousands of years. We were one people, for Pete's sake, right? But because out of necessity to defend against bad ideas, you have to draw a line. And we drew that line to make a clear distinction so that it is clear between what the quote unquote experts that we just watched and a clear line between these ideas that are presented by, Roots of Polynesia. We have to take a strong position and we have to push back, because if we don't, then the clarity that needs to be brought into our discussions as Samoans and as Tongans can't provide that clarity if we're just gonna, blend the lines too much. What's this comment right here? Brandon says, "Let's talk history and origins. I think your viewers deserve that much. If your belief, your ancestors and elders support what you're saying, then you should make clear to everyone that you have facts and evidence that back what you're saying, because your claims and what other Tongan historians are saying don't line up. So to clear the confusion of what's true and what's not, you should have a community of historians that back all the information that you're putting out." We'll get into that a little bit here, Brandon. Send us these experts that you say, Brandon, because I'll give you one observation, Brandon. We reach out to these experts, okay? Very few respond. And you know what? The experts that do respond, and if you watched our podcast, Brandon, we've brought some very strong experts onto the show, right? Like that's like, you obviously don't know what we've talked about or what we've shared on the show. I can tell by your comment, because we've literally had Xiaoxi Ilayu come. He has PhD. He's done research in Uvea, Futuna, Tokelau, Tuvalu. He's gone to Samoa. He's done interviews with people. That's one of the strengths he brings, is not only his academics, but he's been on the ground in all these places and had those conversations, right? We've also brought David Burley. This guy has compiled, and we'll talk through a little bit of that here in a little bit. This guy has compiled more scientific data than any of those quote unquote experts that were on that video. Those experts have not done any field work. Those experts do not bring any raw data to the table. What they bring is just the words that they say that sometimes don't make sense, like metaphorically. What's metaphorically mean? How solid is metaphorical, Brandon? Right? That, like, how does that make sense? They all metaphorically represent these things. Like, that's not scientific. That has nothing to do with what you're asking for. So, Brandon, go watch our shows. You can go watch them, or just keep following, because we believe that repetition is king, and we're going to repeat. Like, we're going to talk about David Burley here and the Ilionitis genetic study that Roots of Polynesia shows here, and we'll break that down. We will repeat as needed. Muscle memory, right? Mika, paying member of the Polynesianized podcast, says, like our Kaumatua said, "Ai ke a ke toe hau a hai o whai ngawe." Right? That's yeah. No, who else is going to do it? Right? Somebody's got to do it. Somebody's got to do it. My wife probably doesn't like it that I'm doing it, but hey, hopefully I don't get put in the doghouse too much. Oh, Yahweh. All right. Let's just because I know Dave, even though he's joining in from Facebook, but he's a paying member of the Polynesianized podcast. He says, "Show him your Lani Lapaha, and that should shut all the historians and experts." That's one thing that Devita Fale always brings that is pretty compelling. Devita Fale says, You know what? Where are you? Where's your parents and grandparents buried? Where will you be buried? Right? And then Tevita Fale says, my grandfather is buried on Alangi. My great grandfather is buried on Alangi. My great grandmother is buried on Afale. She could have been buried in Alangi with the Tuitonga, but for whatever reason, she chose to be buried with her Tuihatakalawa family. All right. So appreciate that. All right. The next video. I think we're done with that. We're gonna go to the next video that we were gonna discuss. And this is another one, you know. We'll keep doing what we're doing until we don't need to do it no more. Let's bring this one. Let's see here. Let's add to the stage. Let's watch this video right here.
Fascinating that modern genetics has confirmed that the expansion of Polynesian people really kicked off in Samoa in about the 9th century. And then 800 years later, a Tahitian priest, politician, scientist, whatever we want to call him, Tupaya, referred to the main Samoan island as the father of all the rest. Head exploding meme.
I think the beautiful thing about genetics is now we can take something that's very quantitative, confirm that they did happen. So now, we're left with acknowledging that the greatest explorers, actually ocean explorers, the first long distance ones were not Columbus and Vasco da Gama, but they were the Polynesians, who have long said that. I mean, they have oral histories, right? But we kind of privileged the written histories, and we didn't really acknowledge it. So I think it's just nice that genetics can now confirm what the Polynesians already knew, bring it to a wider audience.
Anyhow, all of this is to say that the Polynesian expansion, that Polynesian populations did not start in America, do not descend from Native Americans mainly, because archaeologically, genetically, and according to the words of Tupaya himself, it all started in Samoa. It's here where genetics and oral history, they kind of come together. It's pretty crazy. Check this out. In 1769, Captain Cook, British explorer, reached Tahiti, where he met Tupaya, an Arioi priest and a Tahua, man of knowledge, incredibly knowledgeable. Really, Cook couldn't have met anyone better, really. Tupaya agreed to sail with the British and act as their translator. Whilst he was sailing with them, he helped the British draw an absolutely spectacular map. Let's check this out. My goodness. Some of these names are lost in translation, and some of them may refer to mythical locations, but 50 of the islands on this map have been identified as real places. Aya claims to have visited 12 islands in his lifetime. Some of these are really crazy, like this island far to the north, Oahuarua. That's probably Oahu in Hawaii, way far to the north. Anyway, in chatting to the British, the history of his people, Tupaya refers to the main Samoan island, Savaii, or as he called it, Oheavi, as the father of all the rest. Isn't it absolutely fascinating? I'd love to go into Lapita culture in more detail. That would make a great video in the future. But for now, for this video, all we need to know is that this incredible maritime Polynesian culture had its roots in Asia, was expanding to the east, and eventually reached Samoa. There's a site there, Mulifanua, that contains Lapita pottery. It dates to 900 to 750 BCE, and it's Samoa that would form another hub in this Polynesian expansion.
For this study, we focus just on Polynesia, not the process of the people getting to Polynesia. So we zoom in to starting with Samoa, and then the expansion that occurs from Samoa all the way out to Easter Island and all the other French Polynesian islands, etc.
Fascinating.
Okay. So, once again, right, they that's a good point. That's a good point here by Mika. I said, I thought Manua was the father of Ha'amoa. This is where it's kind of hilarious, right? What makes this hilarious is the level of inconsistencies. And number one, that's assuming that the translations were correct. That's assuming that the interpretations after the fact are correct. But let's concede all of that. Let's just assume that this is all correct. We'll give it all. We'll concede all of that. Even though there are those things that just doesn't make any sense, right? let's be fair. Not be fair. We'll give ourselves a handicap and just concede that to them. But you notice is when you go to the actual scientist, he says Polynesian. Then when you go to that individual who's kind of referencing the scientist and the oral history, he says Samoa, right? And we'll get into that in here in a little bit, but there's this chopping up of these comments and ideas. But we'll break it down. So what we did, so what we've done is those two studies. First one, by Ldks, the one who's talking there. And if you notice in the video, he says, we don't talk about coming from Southeast Asia. We just assume the model says Samoa. We just started there, right? He doesn't explain how or why he chose that. It's just our model just assumes Samoa because they don't have the data to go, well, where does Samoa come from? Right? They just make an assumption. The model, and we'll get into it, it's just modeled that way, right? Because he's saying, he literally says in that video, we are not looking on how Polynesians got to Western Polynesia or to Polynesia. We're just looking at the expansion. That alone. But what happens is when you don't pay attention, and we've already gone through this study, and we've already talked through it, but we'll do it again. But you know who was looking for the origin of Polynesia before it got to Samoa was David Burley. And so you conflict these two ideas together. You take an interpretation of, oh, this means the origin of Polynesia. Is like, well, that's not what the guy said. And when you even look at the maps, that's not what the maps are saying. It appears that way. It's just like the interpretation of progenitors when Tupou the First says, oh, the progenitors of the Tu'itonga and the Tu'ikanakupolu come from Samoa. When you don't understand that the Tongan system is your mom can come from anywhere, but your dad has to be a Tu'itonga or a Tu'ikanakupolu or a Tu'ihatakalaua, which is literally a male line that always exists from Tonga. You can never be a Tu'ikanakupolu, a Tu'ihatakalaua, or a Tu'itonga. So naturally, if you understand the Tongan system, you would know that the progenitors means females. Once again, if you knew what each study and each approach was trying to prove, then you would understand how to interpret the comments that they're making. You'll notice that the Ildks guy never said, oh, that Samoans are the greatest navigators. He says Polynesians, because he literally is saying, I'm not giving you the origin of Polynesia. I am telling you how the expansion went eastward. That's literally what's going on. But hey, what do I know? I'm just a biased Tongan guy who has Samoan and Fijian blood. But I'm just a biased guy. I'm just a guy who doesn't know. So let's walk through it, right? Polynesia, 2 evidence streams, 1 long story. 1 story that's longer than it needs to be because of people online. But hey, let's get into it. 1 ocean, 2 different questions. How did Polynesia begin? That's 1 question. How did later voyages move east? Right? That's the question. Those are 2 different questions. And when you have 2 different questions, you have 2 different answers. David Burley asks, how did Polynesia begin? Alex, I believe is his first name. Ildks says how later voyages moved east. You notice the difference? Hey? All right. So, archaeology and genomic networks look at different moments in the story. What changes when we separate the first settlement from later expansion? The story becomes clearer because we stop asking one study to answer every question, right? So you have roots of Polynesia here, and all our Samoan brothers and sisters who are pushing this narrative, you're trying to take the question of how did later voyages move east, and you're trying to tell it, oh, it answers where Polynesia begins from, right? Burley, Weisler, and Zhao addressed the early Lapita landfall and settlement sequence at Nuku'aleka, Tongatapu around 2838 BP, while Ioannidis and colleagues model, you got to understand, remember the model? They're modeling out of Samoa. Like, that's the key word there. A much later eastward founder sequence beginning from Samoa in the available modern genome data. These are different episodes separated by many centuries, I would say thousands of years, studied with different evidence. Okay? That's the mistake that's being done. It's the rookie mistake, right? And you don't understand. Brandon, what is your Brandon Timer, what is the source of your information coming, if you don't mind? No problem. It's that study that's mentioned, but I believe I put it at the end. Let me skip ahead. Right there. Sources: Burley, Weisler, and Zhao, 2012. Burley, 2023. The Birth of Polynesia. That 2023 is the actual book. That book is very comprehensive. Let me just drop that in the chat so that everyone has it. That book has all of that information combined of the genetic evidence for Tonga as a founding colony, and it also has the archaeological evidence. It has the agricultural evidence. It just has all the evidence that you could possibly be looking for. And then the other one is the, Ioannidis article. You can search that online and have that as well. But I'll give you the Burley book because you can download it for free. So let's go through that. We'll come back, but that's your answer there. Let's go back here. All right. So let's go to the next slide. So remember, they're totally different structure, totally different questions. Let's start with Nuku'aleka anchors the first settlement, right? Tongatapu, Tonga. First landfall dated 2838 plus or minus 8 years. You see how the dating is pretty dang close, right? And that's going to be a big difference. A 16-year interval, 2030 to 2830 to 2846. So this is just the key 8 years ahead, 8 years back. That's relatively precise, right? That is very precise. When you go off of carbon dating, you're going hundreds of years in each direction, right? So that's the other thing too. The dating methodology that David Burley uses is very precise, right? So Burley, Weisler, and Zhao identified Nuku'aleka as a founder colony for Polynesian settlement. You see the difference? It's about Polynesian settlement, the founder colony of the Polynesian settlement. It's not talking about a migration of what's already Polynesian. It's like, no, where or how did Polynesians become Polynesians? Right? Like the other study is saying, no, they're already Polynesians. We're tracking how they voyage and they expand. Burley is asking the question, when did Polynesians become Polynesians? Starting, if you believe from Southeast Asia through Melanesia and going into Polynesia, that's the route. They said, well, where along that path did they become Polynesian? The culture, the civilization that's known as Polynesians, right? So that's really the question that's being asked there. So why does precise first settlement date matter? A precise date gives a wider history, a firm chronological anchor. The uranium thorium date of 2838 plus or minus BP at Nuku'aleka allows researchers to place later settlements pottery change, and population history in sequence rather than treating them as one undifferentiated past. It does not by itself reconstruct every voyage or prove every later cultural development. So, once again, the precise dating, once you get the precise dating, it's like one anchor point that you can start building from, right? That is not right off the bat on its own discuss migration. What it does is it anchors certain data points. Then you can use that anchor to compare all the other data points, including genetic, including Lapita pottery, including agricultural behavior. Now, once you've anchored that the settlement was there, then you can tie, oh, where's that pottery from? When it got there, how it was used. Then you can tie agricultural behavior. Then you can tie certain tools and practices. You anchor it because of the precise dating. That's why that's really important. Okay. All right. Next. Why Nukuleka matters. It is, that gentleman was like, oh, it's Mulifanua is the oldest. It's like, well, that's not the earliest Lapita site known in Polynesia. It literally is Nukuleka. And it's down to within a 16-year window, right? Early ceramics, unlike later West Polynesian pottery. So there are unique features of the Nukuleka pottery, Lapita pottery, that's not found anywhere else in Western Polynesia. Another indicator that that's like a founder colony. Some pottery was transported from the settlers' ancestral homeland. Some of that pottery, and this is what's interesting, and David Burley said this, some of those founder potteries, they haven't found in Melanesia. They haven't found in Southeast Asia. They have no idea where that pottery comes from. He's sending it to all kinds of people to test it and to see if they can find it exactly. He said, hey, all we know is this material is like what? 28 million years old, blah, 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 blah. We know it's this kind of material, but we haven't matched it anywhere in Melanesia. We haven't matched it in anywhere in Southeast Asia. And he's continuing to look for a match there. And like I said, all these things are high precision coral, the tools that they dated, uranium thorium dating. It is the most legit dating with precision that you can get. So what can our archaeology tell us that a later genetic network cannot? So what David Burley is telling us that the genetic study that was mentioned in the video cannot tell us. Okay, and it says archaeology can show where people lived, the material practices they used, the sequence of site occupation, and the dating of specific artifacts and deposits. Like I mentioned earlier, this is why when you're able to pinpoint a date, then you can align all the other data points. At Nukuleka, it identifies early Lapita ceramics, imported pottery, coral file dating, and local settlement development. A genomic network can model patterns of ancestry and founder effects, but it cannot directly excavate the first landfall, a pottery sequence, or settlement's material life, right? All that the genetic study can say is we see that a certain group of genetic material started here and moved across. It does not say where the first settlements are. It does not say when those things happened, right? They cannot date things accurately. They can do some assumptions, but they cannot date things precisely based off of that genetic material. And there's different methodologies that determine where people guess what those dates could be. All right, let's go to the next slide. Burley's expansion frame Tonga to Samoa, right? So this is Burley's archaeological evidence that he's found. And he says, you start in Nukuleka, they move north. They go to Ha'apai, they go to Vava'u, and then they go to Samoa, right? So if you notice, the gentleman who did the genetic study, he said, we modeled assuming the expansion eastward begins in Samoa. Probably because they saw the work that David Burley and them did and said, hey, starting from Tonga going to Samoa, that's pretty solid. We're going to use the expansion from Samoa beyond. Right? Like, it makes sense now why they didn't say the things that what some people are trying to assume that they say. But if you pay attention, they don't say those things. Okay? So Burley 2023, that's in the book that we shared. Synthesis describes expansion from the Tongatapu founder settlement northward through Tonga to Samoa and beyond. What does a regional expansion pathway show and what does it not show? Well, it shows the broad archaeological framing. Burley's synthesis describes expansion from Tongatapu, the founder settlement, northward through the Tongan Islands to Samoa and beyond. It does not identify an exact canoe-by-canoe route, a single voyage, or every intermediate stop. The Tonga to Samoa map is therefore a schematic of this expansion frame, not literal reconstruction of the specific voyage. So what he's done is he's taken the dating and he's found that within 50 years, they show up in Ha'apai. Within about 80 years, they show up in Vava'u. Within 100 years, they show up in Samoa. So these are rapid expansions. This is why, for all intents and purposes, Tonga and Samoa were almost settled at the same time, right? They are almost back to back. When you're talking about thousands of years and you were settled within 100 years of each other, for all intents and purposes, it's a single settlement, right? Within one generation. But it also shows that from the very beginning, they had astronomical knowledge. They had sailing capabilities because within a 50 to 80 year period, they're discovering these lands and settling them, right? So once again, we're the same people. We're the same country. We have the same culture. Just like America, you go to the South, little nuance there. You go to the Northeast corner, little nuances there. You go to the Rocky Mountains, little nuances there. You go to the Pacific Northwest, little nuances there. That's what's happened in Polynesia. We're all the same people who were intermarrying for thousands of years, but we developed some unique features between us, but the core, like culture and civilization, is what we shared. And that cohesiveness was maintained over thousands of years through intermarrying. So we're all the same people, right? And this idea that Samoa was a separate nation and Tonga was a separate nation, that did not exist until colonization, right? And we see that the early inklings of that separation happening even before Tonga and Samoa are colonized, because the missionaries were starting to draw boundaries, right? Because they did not see Polynesians as a nation, though I will make an exception for Captain Cook. Captain Cook calls the Polynesians a nation because he saw similar language, he saw similar culture, he saw similar government structures to an extent, he saw similar religion and practices, though he does say that on Tongatapu and in the Tongan Islands, he sees a much more stratified structure, right? Because it's the capital, it is the center. And so when the closer you get to the center, as power gets consolidated, there's more stratification, right? And order that separates the structure of society. Anyways, next one. Ancient DNA adds a second lens. And this is the other thing that people don't realize, is that David Burley does also have additional DNA evidence to back up. So he has multiple layer points of data, right? This is why it's like, my Samoan brothers and sisters, it's almost undeniable. This is kind of getting like super, like, I don't know if it's hilarious, ridiculous, and so forth. But like there comes to a point where it's like, guys, if you jump off the cliff and you break your leg every time you jump off, what do you think is going to happen the next time you jump off? You're going to break your leg again. It's like the definition of insanity. We're getting to a point where let's just get over it. It's not the end of the world. It's reality. And let's focus on what's important. And that is what our ancestors had accomplished, what unites us, but we have to figure this out. We have to get alignment on the historical facts, right? It's just the same as bad oral history. You have to resolve the bad oral history, try and get to the oral history that is closest to the reality and truth, and then we move forward. But trying to give this other stuff that, like, oh, the Polynesian Eyes podcast is, they're in denial. They're trying to rewrite history. It's like, guys, this is why I laugh and people say, oh, he's mocking us. He's not being serious. It's like, dude, I'm just like, guys. It's like you guys want me to look at the sun and say there's no sun there. It's like, it's overwhelming. It literally is overwhelming. So let's see here. Ancient DNA adds a second lens. A Talasiu Tongatapu individual was included in ancient DNA research, one of the oldest human remains that were found in Polynesia was found in Nuku'uleka. The sample dates back to 2,700 to 2,300 BP. So almost at the same time, just shortly after, when they arrived. So this is relatively first, within a generation or two, of the first arrival of the Tongans into Tonga, right? The Polynesians. It helps place early Tongan evidence within the wider Southwest Pacific story. Ancient DNA adds population history. It does not replace the archaeological sequence, right? So that's the thing that we got to remember here. This doesn't replace the archaeological fact on dating. What it does is it adds a population data set. This is why the genetic study that's done by the Ldks guy, it doesn't replace the archaeological history or facts. What it does is it adds a movement. We can track movement of people, but it doesn't replace when people first got there, how they got there, and what tools and the environment was. How do material evidence and ancient DNA strengthen each other? So this is why David Burley includes this in his book. The answer: complementary questions. Material evidence establishes the context, what site, what layer, what date, what objects, while ancient DNA adds evidence about ancestry and population relationships. For particular individuals, the Talasiu individual from Tongatapu gives ancient genomic context to an early Tongan archaeological landscape, but a single sample is not complete map of all the Pacific population, right? So once again, it just gives us information of the group there. The one thing, and I don't know if it mentions here, but I'll mention it, is the one unique thing about the data set that this DNA study that Burley brings, just like that one piece of pottery that they cannot identify from Melanesia, Southeast Asia, the generally accepted migration of Polynesians is from, now I don't agree with this. I have a little bit of a nuanced take on it, but I don't want to muddy the waters with that. They come from Southeast Asia, right? They come down from Southeast Asia. They intermingle in Melanesia, love our brothers and sisters from Fiji, but they say, oh, the Tongans come from Fiji, right? That mingling in Melanesia before they get to Tongatapu, and then that's where Polynesians come. The only problem with that, and this is like what I said earlier, the data here says the archaeological information provided by archaeology doesn't tell us about the genetic material of the first arrivals, but that DNA sample that was developed by David Burley and his team and submitted, it has no Melanesian blood in it. which asks a big question about this whole idea of we became Polynesians by intermingling with Melanesia. That DNA sample that has no Melanesian blood, right? And relatively close to the first arrival, begs the question, doesn't sound like they spent a lot of time in Melanesia. And they've even found genetic material of people who passed away in Vanuatu that don't have any real mixing of Melanesian blood. So that is something important to consider there, right? That the Polynesian civilization, the idea that it was through the mixing of Melanesia, there's some questions still needed to be answered there. So the studies work at different time scales. David Burley's archaeological with some genetic studies, initial settlement and ancestral Polynesian formation around 2,850 BP and after. West Polynesian focus, that's what David Burley is. The Ldks and genomics networks, it's not focused on what David Burley is focused on. They're focused on later, keyword later, long distance eastward expansion about 830 to 1200. You notice the guy in the video said in the 9th century. Well, there's a big difference between 830 to 1200 CE and 2850 BP. That's thousands of years potentially of difference. And it primarily is focusing on the Eastern Polynesian sequence. Are these competing answers or answers to two different questions? Coming back to what we said from the beginning, they are primarily answers to two different questions. Burley's archaeology concerns early West Polynesian settlement and the formation of the archaeological sequence centered on Tongatapu. Ildks et al. Use modern genomic networks to model a later eastward expansion sequence. They can be compared, but one does not simply cancel the other because their time, depths, samples, and methods are different, right? They're not answering the same question, right? So they're not focusing on the same thing. All right. Slide number 8. The attached map, a later eastward network. This is that Ildks kind of like study. The supplied figure, this is what I took out. This is exactly from the study, depicts the genomic network model of a serial founder expansion. Modeled start. You notice right away, they model Samoa as the start. When you have a model, you got to start somewhere. First eastward node, Rarotonga, Cook Islands. Later branches reach the Society Islands, Tuamotu, Marquesas, Raivavai, and Rapa Nui. What does modeled start mean in a genomic study? Let's see what a modeled start means. It means that within studies, data, and statistical method, Samoa appears as the most likely proximal source node for a serial founder sequence into Eastern Polynesia. You notice it does not deal with Western Polynesia, where we all know that's where Polynesians became Polynesians. It does not mean that the study directly observed an ancient departure from Samoa, that every migration began there, or that Samoa is being identified as the first Lapita settlement in Polynesia. The result is a model-based interference from sampled modern genomes and founder effect patterns. Okay, so what does that mean? It does not mean that every migration eastward was Samoa, and it doesn't guarantee that it was only from Samoa. You notice that Ildks says that Polynesians were the greatest navigators. What it proves is the strongest signal of who settled Polynesia were Polynesians, and that it wasn't like a little bit of Polynesians who settled Eastern Polynesia and there were other groups out there that came in. No, it is heavily a Polynesian settlement. And it does not answer who came from Eastern Polynesia, right? And so that's what this whole thing is trying to answer and describe. But what does everybody else online say? Oh, this study says that Polynesia originated from Samoa. Just like, oh, this letter by Tupou the First said progenitor, so it means all the Tuitonga and the Tuikanakupolo and the Tuihatakalaua and all Tongans come from Samoa. It's the same error applied to two different things, right? It's making the same mistake. Yet I'm the one that's being unreasonable. I'm the one that's not making sense here. I'm the one who's just doesn't bring facts to the table. Guys, this is why I have no problem answering this over and over again. It's like undeniable. I would have to be lying to myself. Right? And then we repeat the same thing over and over and over. And look, this is what we get. Ray, Te Vita wants Samoa to share its glory. So what glory, Ray? See, this is the kind of stuff that's hilarious. Oh, Yahweh. It's okay, Ray. It's okay. There's light at the end of the tunnel. Right? There's light at the end of the tunnel. Mika, Payne, member of the Polynesian Eyes podcast, says, nah, we come from Langi. That's right. We come from Langi. You know, now who decides what Langi means? If you want to listen to the experts, is that the past, present, or future? I don't know where we came from. Maybe we came from the future. So, hey, you know, this is the closest thing we can agree. It's okay. Samoa and Tonga are brothers. Not correct. Except I would make the argument, Ray, and this is one I've kind of come across just because I've seen all this stuff all the times. It's brother and sister. Because from Tonga's perspective, like I said, progenitors, the male is always from Tonga. The female is always from Samoa in the major titles. So it's not brother and brother. It's mostly brother and sister. That's the relationship there, right? So, anyways, just had to do that. I couldn't help myself, Ray. Oh, Yahweh. Let's go to the next one. Oh, no, did I not answer that? Oh no, we talked about what a model is. And if you notice, you see how there's no dates and the thickness of the arrows are the same. That's the reason why. Like, if you paid attention to the minor details of the map itself, it tells you a lot of those things off the bat. But anyways, let's see. Right, it says Samoa is a later launch node. Ioannidis et al., or his group, model a serial founder sequence from Samoa. Rarotonga is the first eastward step in that model, right? So they're tracing the signal of how it goes out, and they've done the same thing. That's one of the things that Burley said when we spoke with him on the podcast, is when they took all the genetic material from the individual that was found in Talasiu, they found that signal weakens as you get further away from Tongatapu and you go to Vava'u, to Ha'apai, Vava'u, and to Samoa, which is another evidence, you know, that points towards Tongatapu for Western Polynesia. They're doing the same thing for Eastern Polynesia, right? You know, that's the signal that they're tracking. This model addresses later East Polynesian expansion. A Samoa starting node for this later network is not a model of initial Lapita settlement. How can one island be a launch node in one period and not the first settlement in another? Right? So trying to understand that relationship between Tonga and Samoa. It's because populations and networks change through time, Tongatapu can be the central to the early West Polynesian settlement sequence, while Samoa can appear as a proximal node for a later eastward expansion in a genomic model. There is no contradiction when the claims are kept in chronological order. An earlier regional settlement, Tongatapu, to Samoa, right? An earlier regional settlement history can create the social and population landscape from which later departures occur. This is why I don't really have a lot of issues with a lot of Eastern Polynesia, like Tupaya and all those guys. If let's assume all the interpretations of the map are correct, even though there's questions with that, but even if we assume that Tupaya accurately highlights Samoa as the father of the rest, I'm not necessarily against that because that's in theory true, and this Ldks study seems to indicate that. And it makes a lot of sense in Western Polynesia. Obviously, knowing that Tonga is the capital in the center, the motivation is to stay as close to the capital as possible, and that going further east means you're further away from that centralized power. So, but it makes sense to me. I really don't have a problem with that. When people are like, "Oh, but everybody in the east says we come from Samoa," and I'm like, "That's fine. I don't have any issue with that. Like that's not a problem. That's makes sense, right? You would use Samoa as a launching point. That I don't really have any beefs with that." So complementary evidence, not a contest. Archaeology, Nukuleka anchors the early West Polynesian settlement. No brainer. Genomic studies, Samoa is a proximal node in a much later eastward model, right? Two different purposes, two different concepts. The key is chronology, first settlement and later expansion, no brainer, right? What becomes clearer when the evidence is placed in one long timeline? The apparent disagreement dissolves in a sequence. Early archaeological evidence anchors first settlement at Nukuleka. Ancient DNA contributes population context or early Tonga. That's what I was mentioning earlier. They measured the DNA signal from that Talasiu genetic markers, and they find basically the same thing that the Ldks guys find from Samoa into Eastern Polynesia. They find the same type of genetic signaling from Tonga to Samoa from that Talasiu DNA. Much later, modern genomic networks model eastward connections from Samoa, placing each result in its own period prevents false choice between Tonga and Samoa, as if both studies were making the same claim. Once again, it is not making the same claim. So, what's the lesson learned here as we come to an end here? Read the dates, read the methods, read together as one, brother and sister. Different evidence streams can describe different chapters of one Pacific story. And that's really what it comes down to, right? This is why I think it's important that we get alignment on what the truth is, what the data is really trying to say. And if the data changes, okay, we will discuss that data when it comes. But it would be it's just silly right now to try and come out and just this is why people who tag us with roots of Polynesia, I was like, roots of Polynesia, man, it's like, this dude, come with something new. Well, we haven't seen anything new. We've already submitted, and these ideas have already tapped out, right? But when you have the title, sometimes you're given mandatory bouts by the committee. We'll take those. That's what we're doing. We're just going to revisit. Repetition is king, and I have Samoan blood, a lot of Samoan blood. I also have Fijian blood. I also have Palangi blood. My mom's Palangi, and it is what it is. It's Tongan American, Samoan American. It's a pretty awesome combo. Polynesian American. Can't argue with those combos, man. I really appreciate everyone's support. We continue to grow our exposure. Um, right now, we continue to grow. All appreciate everyone's comments, subscriptions, being a paid member, sharing the content, hyping it. Um, Mika says people need to learn how to read and also stop cutting and pasting bits to suit our narrative, like Root of Polynesia, because it kills the real truth. That's fair. That's 100%. And that's a a really good thing to say. This is why we laugh when we see Roots of Polynesia. That's it's like clickbait. Doesn't make sense, but that's fine. Maybe if that's what you want, if that's what makes you happy. I think it was Tuitonga Momo who Samoa came to Tuitonga Momo. Some of the oral history in Tonga is Samoa came to Tuitonga Momo and said, you know what, we want to kind of do our own thing a little. We want a little bit more independence slash, because in the very beginning of the Polynesian Empire, Samoa and Tonga were like super close, and the Tuitonga and the ruling families were very interconnected, right? And so, yes, Talasiu is in Mua, TY. So this is another thing that a lot of people, even in Tonga, don't understand. When you say Mua, it really is 3 villages combined into one. You start with Tatakamotonga. Actually, a lot of our Samoan brothers and sisters settled in Tatakamotonga. A lot of Samoan blood there because, we're intermarrying very close. That's where that name comes from. La Paja is kind of like the core. A lot of the heavy activity of the Tuitonga is centered right there, though Tatakamotonga is involved in that, and also Talasiu, right? Those are the 3 areas that's considered Mua, the ancient capital. So, yes. Really appreciate that. Really appreciate the support that everyone's giving. I kind of lost my chain of thought. I apologize for that. But we'll continue to do this. We enjoy it. We'll keep doing what we do. Like we're saying earlier, if you like the clickbait, if you like to be fed what you think is the truth without thinking a little bit, you have Roots of Polynesia. That's great. Some people just want that. That's fine. Now, if you're really kind of searching for the truth and want a little more depth rather than the brain rot, hey, that's why we're here. And we'll continue to do what we do as long as the spouse and those allow it to happen, right? Mika, paying member of the Polynesian Eyes podcast, says Malotua Ovatu to you and everyone in here trying to learn our history. Really appreciate it, Mika. Really appreciate the support. With that being said, another live digital conversation on the Polynesian Eyes podcast comes to an end. Please like, share, comment, hype, anything that you can do. If you can contribute as a paying member, great. If not, great ways to contribute is like, share, comment, and hype it. Really appreciate everyone. Even those who come and question our positions, we invite it. We understand that that's just a natural part of people asking questions, and we will respond. And if there's someone that you think can come on the show, willing to come on the show with a different perspective, we more than welcome that as well. Send them our email, tell them to reach out to us. More than willing to be hospitable in taking care of them while they visit us. With that being said, with every show we say, be bold, don't be afraid to ask the hard questions. But no matter what, always stay curious. With that being said, peace.